in the intelligence network of the Italian resistance movement and fascist squadrismo. On this topic, he has especially on the topic of the squadrismo, he has published an important book in Italian first that has been then translated into English and has been published last year with the title "The Black Shirts Dictatorship," and it came out in 2022 for Routledge. And recently, he has completed a major ERC project on armed associations and political violence in pre-First World War Europe. He's currently working on a book manuscript on this subject, forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. As you say, the major topic of the project is of the ERC project, where was the relationship between, let's say, sociability so associationism on the one hand, and gun or weapons, and violence and political violence. And so in this triangles, we have developed our research with different focuses in the 5 years of research together. And as I said, I very much look forward to her, let's say, the new version of a report, let's say, of the final report of this project. And of course, I would like you to be also curious about our ongoing research. I mean, monographs, and eventually to be informed then in the future when the books will be out. I think this is now what this was my task for now. I will leave the floor to Matteo Millan for his presentation, for his paper, and he has also a PowerPoint, so we'll have probably some pictures or to see. And and then I will look forward to the discussion. I will moderate the discussion afterwards. Thank you so much. Thank you, Matteo, for accepting my invitation.
Thank you very much, Nicola. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much also to Valeria and the other organizers of the Center for Advanced Studies. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today with you, even online. But anyway, I would try to present some of the main features and provisional results of this major ESC project, which just ended the last autumn. And as Nicola mentioned, it's still in progress in some way. So I share a PowerPoint. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yeah. Okay. Great. Sorry, just a second. Okay. I would like to start my presentation on armed associations in Europe before the First World War with 2 examples, just to make clear what we are talking about. Sorry. Okay. So the first example is that of the Volunteer Cyclists and Motorists. Who are these guys with the apparently military-like uniforms? Maybe you can read here, sorry for the bad quality of the pictures, but they are some of the main members of the futurist movement, of the Italian futurist movement. At the center, you can see Filippo Tommaso Morinetti, who was, the leader of the movement, and along with other artists like Boccioni, Sironi, and Sant'Elia. Actually, these uniforms were not the same uniforms as the Italian army, but they were the uniforms of a sort of paramilitary corps called Volunteer Cyclists and Motorists. This picture was taken in 1915 during the early months, at least for Italy, of the First World War. But the Volunteer Cyclists had a little bit longer story. So basically, the first moment in which they saw action was in 1904, so about 10 years before the outbreak of the First World War, during a major congress of one of the most important cycling association in Italy, the Audax. So the congress took place in Brescia, which is in Lombardy, a small city in Lombardy, which is quite close to the Lake of Garda. So after meetings, rides and banquets, some of the members of the Audax took part in a sort of war game with members of the regular army. The war game took place on the Lake of Garda in 1904. And basically the idea was to simulate the landing of Austrian troops on the shores of the lake and some kind of attempt to defend the shore of the lake. So basically there were two parts in game. The regular army played the Austrians, and please remember that at that time Italy was a strict ally of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So basically the regular army played the Austrian, while a group of civilians, cyclists, played the defenders. So basically they patrolled the shore of the lake with a bicycle and simulate a sort of attempt to react against the landing of the Austrian also troops. So everything went quite smoothly, and the generals of the army were really happy of the contribution of these guys. This was the beginning, in some way, of the volunteer cyclists and motorists. And 4 years later, in 1908, the Ministry of War, in some way, recognized the volunteer cyclists and institutionalized the corps. They remained civilians, but it was enacted a law that in some way recognized the support of the state towards this semi-public, semi-private associations. They were armed with the same rifles of the army. They had the uniforms which resemble, except for their hats, which resemble the uniforms of the army. And the idea was to gather together patriots in order to support the efforts of the army in case of war. So basically, this was just one example of similar organization which spread throughout Europe that we will analyze in the course of this paper. Now, a second, quite a different example, which seems to have a very little in common with the case of the volunteer cyclist. We are here in Germany at the end of the 19th century, when after a massive strikes in 1889, the Prussian authorities began to support the formation of a semi-private armed protection groups in the effort to tackle what at that time was defined as strike terrorism. Basically, the Prussian government issued a set of regulations to define the framework for the establishment of what became known as defense organization of the colliery, Zechenwehr actually. The idea was to protect the company and the mining premises. It was at that time particularly frightening, the presence of massive amounts of explosives in the mines, and oppose strikers. Police forces were few in the area, so the idea was to accept and fuel the support of civilians against the strikers. Members of the Zechenwehr were armed with revolvers. And here you can see a picture of a sort of gun license, which authorized members of the Zechenwehr to bear and even use revolvers. They had also armbands, so they can be recognized in the case of strikes. And the mobilization of the Zechenwehr occurred along with other much less formal anti-strike practices, such as the arming of strikebreakers and other employees of colliery. The case was quite significant of a sort of process of transfer and delegation of law enforcement powers from the state authority to private actors. The Zechenwehr never became a mass phenomenon, but they have played quite a significant role, especially after the anti-socialist law were abolished in 1890, and there was a huge rocketing rise of strikes in the Ruhr and throughout Germany. So basically, the case of the volunteer cyclist and of the Zechenwehr were just a couple of examples of a much broader phenomenon which invested the entire European continent, with specifically the project that I coordinated focused on Central and Western Europe. So in pre-1914 Europe, thousands of male European citizens own, handle, and use guns and rifles as members of what I have defined as armed associations. And then we will define them with more precision. And the armed association basically ranged from military youth groups to paramilitary units to civic militia, from company defense units and shooting clubs. So handling guns was a means of instilling patriotic values in young men and preparing them for war to defend their country, but it was also, as the case of the Zechenwehr show, a way of preserving social hierarchies, order, productivity, and to tackle against left-wing unions and parties. At that time, owning a gun was something fashionable and cool, let's say, and he had a magnetic attraction for the younger and older generations alike. People gather in arms in major cities, but also in small villages in the countryside. They could handle modern rifles as well as small but lethal revolvers. So it was in some way a very broad phenomenon which involved thousands and thousands of, especially almost exclusively male citizens, but at the same time it was a phenomenon with a multiplicity of features and characteristics. So my paper today will be structured in this way. I will try to provide you a little bit of historiographical context. Then I will offer you a couple of definitions to define and to circumscribe the phenomenon. Then we will speak a little bit of the legal framework which allow ordinary people to have guns and to gather in arms in armed associations. And then we will focus on these two major groups of armed associations, those operating in the social and the labor sphere, and the so-called war-related associations. And then I will devote a couple of slides and a few minutes to see what happened once the First World War broke out. And finally, I will provide you with some provisional result and conclusion. So, speaking about and thinking about the relationship between weapons and organized groups, need to think a little bit outside of the box in some way. So basically outside the familiar concept of paramilitarism and the predictable environments of actual warfare, state collapse, major revolutionary events, and disruptive social conflicts. Nothing like that happened in Central and Western Europe before the First World War. Of course, there were major social conflicts, the rise of in numbers of strikes, and even in some cases revolts and revolutionary-like events, but it was a time of peace, of economic and political and social development, of huge and powerful transformation of the social and political sphere. But the state remained in power, police forces were, and the military were really effective in managing public order. And yet, armed associations develop in this context. So I will try now to define a little bit what we mean by paramilitarism and the meaning that I have attached to armed associations. So of course, the two concepts have something in common, but also they have differences. So a first definition of paramilitarism, which is mainly linked to contemporary times. Think about the civil war in Syria, for example, or in Iraq, is made in a quite recent book by Ugur Mitungor, a scholar who worked in Dublin and then in Amsterdam. And he basically defined paramilitarism as a sort of umbrella concept and a phenomenology which is quite distinguished by various levels of state involvement, from local vigilantes to professional paramilitary units. And this is a system in which a state has a relationship with irregular armed organizations that carry out violence. So basically, according to these scholars, we have a state-sponsored militia, pro-government militia. In some way, the state is always present and is a major actor in supporting and in some way recognizing, although often informally, armed and paramilitary units. But I would like to stress an aspect in this definition, the fact that these are irregular armed organizations, which are basically illegal. A second definition is by a major leading scholar of fascism and fascist paramilitary violence, Sven Reichert, who defined paramilitarism in connection with the development of radical right-wing paramilitary groups after the end of the First World War. According to Reichert, there are three elements which are important for paramilitarism: continuous violent propaganda, the image of the street fighter, and the presentation of paramilitary groups as mass organizations. In some way, the definition given by Reichert mirror another important and the influential definition by one of the most renowned fascist scholar, Emilio Gentile, who defined the fascist party as a militia party, il partito milizia in Gentile's word. So basically the idea was that paramilitary groups overlap with party organization, and that violence was crucial in order to allow this party, basically the Nazi and the Italian fascist party, to seize power and to control the streets. Members of these groups were political soldiers for whom violence itself functioned as a performative act and created meaning for the young street fighters. According to Reichert, it was a new phenomenon of the early 20th century whose emergence was facilitated by the economic, social, and cultural crisis of the 1920s and 1930s. So basically, it was the result of the First World War and of its aftermath. Finally, a third working definition by two major scholars of paramilitarism who in the recent year have innovated the field, Robert Gerbert and John Horn from Dublin. According to them, paramilitary groups are military or quasi-military organizations and practices that either expand or replace the activities of conventional military formation. And again, according to these scholars, the emergence of paramilitary groups after the Great War was even more extraordinary because they appear after a century in which national armies had become the norm and modern police formation, penal codes, and prisons had helped to firmly establish a largely unchallenged monopoly of force in the hands of state. So basically, Gerbert and Horn made some kind of they compare and contrast what happened after the First World War with the period of the so-called Belle Époque, stressing the fact that paramilitary groups emergence was largely the result of state collapse and its working and repressive bodies, especially police and military forces. So basically the collapse of the state, the negation of the so-called, it's a controversial category, I'm aware of that, the collapse of the monopoly of force basically produced the emergence of a paramilitary group as a sort of substitution in respect to ordinary traditional state repressive forces. Actually, now we are speaking of armed groups that emerge not in case of state collapse, of radical politics, of the absence of state monopoly, but actually in a political environment which was characterized by the opposite. So by a strong presence of the state, which as never before the so-called Belle Époque, the 20 years before the First World War, was strong and able to control many aspects of the political and social life, at least in Central and Western Europe. So here is the working definition that we have perfected in the course of the project. So armed associations are legally recognized private or semi-public armed groups operating in the tiny space between anti-systemic legal violence and state violence. On the one side, we have usual state violence as those enforced by police forces and the military, for example. On the other side, there are the anti-systemic legal violence by terrorist groups like the anarchists, were a major threat and scare in pre-war Europe, or criminals, or whoever. So armed associations were operating between these two more familiar kind of violence. So they were legally recognized and they operated in a legal way. This is a major difference compared to the previous definition of paramilitaries. So it would be complicated in some way to define all the armed associations operating in Europe before the First World War as paramilitary groups. Some of them, I think that they were, but all the armed associations share the fact that they were legal association. This is why I prefer the use of the term association instead of groups or organization. So the idea that there was a law that authorized the members of these groups to be armed and to gather together, to be part of an association which was in some way recognized by the state. So they share a lot of features at both micro and micro level. At micro level, the fact is that they all developed in times of peace. They were the synthesis of bottom-up and top-down initiatives. So this is pretty clear in the case of the volunteer cyclists that I mentioned at the beginning. So basically, there was some kind of initiative arising from the society, which was later on recognized by the state. They were a continental phenomenon. And quite surprisingly, maybe we can come back on that in the discussion, they emerged or were transformed basically all at the same time, which is in the 10 years across, mainly in the 10 years across the 2 centuries. At the micro levels, they were made of civilian volunteers. So basically, they were not state organization. They remain private or semi-public, but anyway, private and organizations made of civilians, not members of the police or the military. They were legally recognized associations. As I mentioned earlier, there were laws or regulations that authorized these people to gather in arms, with a couple of exceptions. And in these groups, weapons and violence were legitimate course of action. So the use of weapons was not only the result of illegal practices. Of course, their action can be illegal, but the fact of having, possessing, owning weapons and even use them was recognized by the law and authorized by police and the state authorities. As the two examples that I mentioned at the beginning of this paper, we have identified two main groups of armed associations. On the one side, we have war-related associations, as in the case of the volunteer cyclists. So basically groups whose aim was to train or to prepare people for the defense of the country or for war. On the other side, there were those groups involved in the enforcing public order and in contrasting left-wing parties and trade unions. So basically groups involving public order enforcement and anti-labor associations. As I will try to show in this paper, these were actually only two sides of the same coin. They were not, in my opinion, two different phenomena. And it seems quite weird to think that people dressing military-like uniforms can have something in common with the Zechenwehr or the citizen militia or whatever. But actually, I think that what keep all these groups together was the fact that they aim to be a response to powerful and fast processes of democratization which were going on throughout Europe in this period. No, sorry. So what was this period? This period has been usually and a little bit anachronistically defined as the Belle Époque. I use the term as a sort of shortcut, but I'm aware, maybe we can talk about that in the discussion, that it's quite controversial. But in many accounts, scholarly accounts of the period, the Belle Époque is defined as a period of major social, cultural, and political developments, of technological innovation, of transformation in some way of Europe. It's the first, one of the first hints of modernity in Central and Western Europe. At the same time, it was a period of rocketing numbers of strikes, proliferation of workers' organization, and huge and sometimes violent social conflict. The systematic and complex transition from traditional conservatism to elite cycles of politicians to mass politics and increasing mass participation caused a sort of social earthquake that changed the political and social face of the continent. For example, just think about the impact on Western Europe of the 1905 Russian Revolution, the spread and the activism of trade unions and socialist parties, the emergence of the nationalist question, for example, in Ireland, the unprecedented waves of strikes and the enlargement of the franchise. And all these transformations pose significant challenges to the established elites and middle classes and open up and explore spaces for popular participation and new forms of citizenship. In this context, ordinary police forces were hard-pressed to deal with the unprecedented pace of mass mobilization. We assisted to a modernization of police forces, but in terms of numbers and the effectiveness of police actions, in some way, the social conflicts were much widespread and powerful, so that police forces were unable to keep peace with them. At the same time, we will come back on that later. Brutal repression in many European countries was no more an option. And when it occurred, like an example in the aftermath of the so-called tragic week in 1909 in Spain, this produced a mass wave of local, domestic, and international protest against the use of repression. The same happened in Italy during the so-called Facts of Milan in 1898. So in many European countries, brutal repression with the use of massive use of violence was no more an option, because actually this can produce a sort of boomerang effect, which was much worse than the goals that repression aimed to achieve. At the same time, I think that the combination between fast and deep social and political transformation and the fact that repression was no more available produced a huge crisis of insecurity, which spread throughout middle classes and elites alike. And this contributed to the emergence of armed associations. As I mentioned earlier, one crucial aspect of in the definition of armed associations were the fact that they were operating within the legal framework provided by penal codes, state regulation, and so on and so forth. This requires in some way or some kind of efforts of imagination, as some historians such as Dagmar Elleberg have shown. Pre-1914 Europe was a continent in which revolvers, small firearms, shotguns, and rifles were basically part of the ordinary life of thousands and thousands of people. The idea that strict preventive controls through gun license be performed by the state was something that was introduced in Europe, in many European countries actually, only in the 1920s and the 1930s, so after the First World War. The idea behind this was that having and carrying and also sometimes using a gun was a sort of a natural right for ordinary people. And as some commentators stress, to find a balance between the principle of authority and individual freedom was really hard for many European polities at that time. In particular, Republican France and Imperial Germany did not have any specific regulation regarding the use and the carrying of guns. On the contrary, there was some kind of special law in Italy and the Austrian Hungarian Empire, but the enforcement was quite mild, and carrying a gun was often considered a personal right. State legislation was strongly affected by the proliferation and spread of cheap mass-produced revolvers and pistols in the period, which changed also political and social habits in the continent. For example, in 1898, the Habsburg government allowed private citizens to carry small pistols without gun license, and this produced a significant increase in incidents, suicide rates, and interpersonal conflicts. If you combine this situation, which it was basically based on the individual right to have a gun, if you transpose this on a collective level, the problem significantly increased from the perspective of the state. So occasional gatherings of armed people in case of riots, strikes, and public demonstration were never tolerated. So the fact that people can individually own a gun doesn't mean that they can gather in arms. At the same time, many penal codes and state regulation authorize, both in general and in a case by case, authorize the existence of armed associations. For example, again, an example from Austria, the 1851 imperial patent prohibited the National Guard, but contextually allowed the establishment of the so-called Bürgerkorps. We will see a few pictures after in a few slides, whose members were authorized to carry weapons as a group and therefore independently from individual gun licenses. Anyway, what I would like to stress is that the legal framework doesn't perfectly reflect the complexity of the social reality, but only the ideal representation of the state-society relationship. Nevertheless, laws and regulation largely contribute to define the rules of the game and are something that is really important to keep in mind in order to understand how armed associations in various European countries actually work, develop, and what was the legitimation attached to their existence and to the actions of their members. This is very important, as I would like to stress this again. Armed associations were not a mere product of state-sponsored initiative, but of bottom-up processes arising from this society. So a couple of examples again of armed associations operating in the social and labor sphere. One fact that characterized them was that they perform and carry out actual violence. It was not some kind of a performative violence. It was, however, a low intensity violence. Just to be clear, there are no, I'm not trying to equate what happened in this period during the Belle Époque with what happened after the end of the war. The levels of violence in terms of people got hurt, of injured, of people killed are simply not comparable. But these groups perform low-intensity acts of violence in terms of beating people, of using violence against strikers, against protesters, and also sometimes killing them. However, all the groups operating in the social sphere can be divided in two main categories. So there were old associations, like in the case here, the picture on my left of the citizen patrols in Italy, which was a sort of old-fashioned militia, which was established in the early 19th century by the Pope to patrol at night the streets of Bologna in northern Italy, but which was basically refounded at the beginning of the 19th century in order to support police forces in the repression of strikes in the city. Something like that happened with, it was probably the larger militia operating in Europe at that time, the Somatén Armado de Cataluña, which had 40,000 members in 1911, operated in Spain, in Catalonia, and in the city of, in the outskirts of Barcelona. It was founded in the Middle Ages to fight against the so-called Moors and the bandits in the countryside of Catalonia, but then they fought against Napoleon during the French invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, and then they were re-established as a sort of joint venture between the military and the civilian elites of Catalonia at the end of the 19th century, and they perform in support of police forces a lot of actions in case of major strikes, for example, during the so-called Tragic Week 1909, during the general strike in 1902, and again they became one of the main actors of repression after 1919 in the city of Barcelona. But there were also newly established associations, like in the case here in the picture of the so-called yellow unions in France, but also in the case of the Zechenwehr, with which I started the paper. It is also the case of the Civilian Defense League in Liverpool, which was founded in 1911 in the middle of a strike, and it was a group of 2,500 members who devoted their actions to support police forces and replace workers as strike breakers, basically, in case of strike. And just to remain in Britain, is also the case of the Volunteer Police Force, which was a quasi-vigilante private police, which was established in London, more or less at the same period. And it could enjoy the general support of peers and important politicians, such as the Duke of Abercorn. In Italy, for example, the case of the so-called volunteer workers, which was an anti-strike militia organized in the province of Parma to react against the militancy of left-wing trade unions. All these groups, in some way, were a response to what, in an old book, John Horne had defined one of the paradoxes of the modern state. So basically, that while ordinary police forces were hardly able to deal with the unprecedented pace of mass mobilization in the social sphere, which characterized the pre-war years, at the same time, harsh and brutal repression became politically unbearable in the age of mass politics. And the fact it was pretty easy and simple to understand. Strikers were no more considered as inferior people, for the simple fact that in many cases they can vote. So basically, they are citizens, and the brutal repression is, controversial if used against voters. This doesn't mean that Europe at that time was a peaceful continent in which police was not brutal and didn't use repression, but in many cases, the brutal mass repression that characterized the last decades of the 19th century was no more a viable political option at the beginning of the 20th century. And then we have the second group of armed associations, that is using Rachel Krastel's definition. I have defined war-related associations. So a major difference is that although they seem much more similar to ordinary military men, they don't perform actual violence, but only potential and performative violence. These associations operated in various spheres. For example, war preparation, as in the case of the Volunteer Cyclists, or the boat motorists in Germany. Here, the first pictures. They contribute also to bourgeois realignment of the society, like in the case of the shooting clubs, which are really widespread in Germany. And finally, in the field of education. Armed youth groups were a major novelty in Europe at that time. They started in the 1880s in Britain, but soon developed throughout Europe. The idea was that using rifles and military-like drilling and the uniform was the best way to educate the younger generations and to prepare them for war. An aspect that I would like to stress, was that the fact of having these two kinds of associations, war-related and associations operating in the social sphere, this was basically just two faces of the same coin. The idea was to realign the so-called loyal classes in order to defend public order. So this requires a sort of defensive, proactive initiative, like those performed by associations operating in the social sphere, and also the realignment of the loyal classes and the education of the new generations in order to consolidate the social order. This means also that preparing for war was not something separated from the defense of the domestic front, from the defense against the revolutions, against the widespread and powerful affirmation of left-wing and socialist parties. Just a quick quotation. This was from a letter that a member of a Bürgerkorps, which was this sort of old-fashioned militia, which were basically renewed and refounded at the beginning of the 20th century throughout the Austrian half of the Habsburg Empire. If it had to come by God's will that an enemy, wherever he might be from, the interior or the exterior, so basically an equation between the interior and the domestic and the exterior enemy, would disturb the peace and the quiet of the country, attack the rights and honor of our emperor, the Schützenkorps would not waste an instant in responding to this call, weapons in hands. So the idea was that basically the external diplomatic, international war-related sphere was just one face of the coin, and the other being the idea of defending the domestic front against the idea of subversion and the risk that left-wing mass party can take control of the state apparatus. So what happened once the First World War broke out? So many armed associations, the war, especially the war-related associations, went to war. It was the case of the Volunteer Cyclists and Motorists. In that moment, in August 1914, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, along with other futurists, bought what Marinetti defined an iron horse, which was a bicycle, more prosaically, and enrolled in the Milan battalion of the Volunteer Cyclists, and they fought once Italy entered the war in the Lake of Garda, paradoxically, curiously, in the same places in which the Volunteer Cyclists were founded about 10 years before. With few success, with little success actually, and so this brought the supreme commander of the Italian army, General Cadorna, to disband all the volunteer corps in November 1915. But it was also the case of two major, huge paramilitary militia which developed in Ireland. Maybe you have heard about them, the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Irish Volunteers. Here is a picture of the Irish Volunteers, which developed in the context of the Home Rule crisis between 1911 and 1914. And then once the First World War broke out, the men of these two huge paramilitary groups enrolled in the British Army. For sure, sorry, another aspect is that of youth armed associations that knew fierce militarization and whose development represented a major departure from the pre-war period. In fact, originally, they didn't aim to provide or anticipate military training or to train boys and lads to use weapons, but just to instill patriotic values. But once the war broke out, they knew a much stronger and pervasive militarization, which made them groups to promote physical force, discipline, and love for the country, and also prepare young boys and lads to the military service. For sure, the war that armed association prepared for during the pre-war period was much different from the actual war that broke out in August 1914. So the volunteer cyclists, but also the German volunteer motor yacht corps were all preparing for war, for a very different kind of war, and generally speaking, the military results were quite poor. However, the outbreak of the war meant that mobilization not only of war-related associations, but also of those groups that had been established to enforce public order and replace workers during major strikes. It's the case of the already mentioned Liverpool Civil Defence League, became a sort of strike breaking and worker replacing groups, and all the members of the Liverpool Civil Defence League became actually special constables, so they act as a sort of ordinary substitute policemen, and also many of them enroll in the reserve of the Volunteer Rifle Corps. Civilian volunteers were also mobilized in the German Kaiserreich. For example, in April 1917, the Saxon government made plans to identify reliable people to back up police forces in case of major social disorders. The volunteers had to be preferably recruited among members of the shooting clubs, pro-military society, and volunteer firefighters. In other words, among those groups which ensure loyal and national attitudes. And in Austria, here is, you can see a Bürger Corps in the picture. Groups were mobilized as reserve forces, and they patrol the street and stand guard outside public buildings in many cities of the empire. Generally speaking, the longer the war progressed, the hectic atmosphere of suspicion against real or imagined enemies paradoxically turned against the tireless defenders of order and property. For example, as more and more men were sent to the front, militiamen were accused of shrinking military service. Staying home, even though patrolling streets in cold nights, was deemed certainly more comfortable than fighting in the muddy trenches of the Western and Eastern fronts. Now, a few general consideration about what happened to armed associations once the war broke out. I would like to focus on two aspects, basically. The first one is their legal status. So the fact that they had a sort of hybrid nature, something between military and civilian, made armed associations quite controversial once the war broke out. So the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 enshrine the right of civilians volunteers to resist invasion under certain conditions. This, however, created a lot of confusion. Austrians, for example, considered the Italian Volunteer Cyclists and Motorists and the Volunteer Cavalry Corps, which was something similar but people on horse, as regular military units, and in many cases they were. And they were treated as such in combat. But, for example, Germans troops consider the Guard Civic, here in the picture, which was an old-fashioned Belgian militia, as illegal, a form of illegal civilian resistance. So basically they were considered as bandits, something not really different from what Germans considered the partisans in occupied Europe during the Second World War. So the idea was that even though they wore uniforms and they were pretty recognizable, at least from their hats, these members of the Belgian militia were considered as people, partisans and bandits operating behind the lines. So they were not protected by the Hague Conventions. And this contributed to fuel the Germans' collective delusions that the Franc-Tireur was an ubiquitous and treacherous figure. A second aspect was that these overzealous volunteers produced a sort of boomerang effect. So the voluntarism embodied by armed associations represent a potential challenge to the monolithic image of patriotism and loyalty that the war required. In this aspect, I think that Lawrence Cole, the historian Lawrence Cole, has worked quite thoroughly on this aspect, and they stress that any form of popular mobilization was seen in a suspicious way by Austrian authorities once the war broke out. So basically, the authorities wasted the reservoir of dynastic loyalty and pro-Austrian sentiment, which characterized the life and the activities of many armed associations. For example, the veteran associations in Austria and the other groups throughout the multinational state. It was therefore, and I quote, more the ruling elites that lost faith in its people rather than the other way around. At the same time, it was also true the opposite. So the overzealous volunteers could develop vigilante attitudes that created significant troubles to the authorities. This happened, for example, in Italy as well as in France, where the Garde Civile were received with skepticism by local prefects, who were annoyed by the volunteer improvisation and they attentions also to minimal aspect that they create more confusion than help. Generally speaking, the longer the war went, less space for the autonomy and independence of armed associations was left. This is pretty obvious in the context of total mobilization. Those groups involved in war-related tasks were progressively absorbed and subject to strict military control and discipline, disbanded and absorbed by the regular units of the army, while other associations operating in the social sphere had difficulties in finding spaces of autonomy, as the voluntary zeal was often seen with suspicion. So just a couple of minutes for a few conclusion on potential impact to assess the potential impact of the project. The first one is that, in my opinion, looking at armed association give us a more nuanced image of pre-1914 Europe, in which the emergence of huge international tensions as well as social conflicts at home produced the armed mobilizations of significant sectors of the European societies. And this mobilization, however, contrary to the definition of usual definitions of paramilitarism, occur within the legal context and in times of peace and with the clear authorization of state authorities. But at the same time, I think they were part of a process of militarization, to use Michael Geyer's famous definitions, which aim to the production of violence. So basically, if our current narratives of the 19th century, the current narratives, the 19th century is depicted as the favorite playground for stories of progress, and the 20th century for moral atrocity. The Belle Époque, so this transition period between the two centuries, comes as a compelling phase of transition, and in some way, the armed associations, I think they may represent the dark side of the period. The second aspect is that the development of armed associations make us to reflect on the relationship between democratizations and association and violence. Armed associations call into question the traditional Tocquevillian theory which sees the development of civil society as the best antidote against totalitarianism and authoritarianism. Because they have the potential to harm people and challenge the state with physical violence, armed associations pose problems to state authorities that other kind of associations do not. Thus, by investigating the double-edged sword nature of armed associations in different countries, I think it's possible to investigate how and to what extent they acted as either as vectors for strengthening state legitimacy, for example, in the pro-loyal classes groups, or challenges to it, and thus offer an original perspective to investigate the resilience of political regime, especially in times of deep and profound changes and social and political transformation. Armed associations also offer a valid interpretative lens through which investigate the relationship between democratization and violence, as I mentioned earlier. And especially, I think that they can tell us a lot on whether and to what extent different polities succeeded in democratizing violence. That is, in John King's words, in making violence always accountable and publicly accountable, and in removing the surplus of violence from the society. So studying armed associations and their relationship with the state and the broader society can tell us a lot about the legitimacy of violence in certain societies. And finally, the presence of mass armed associations in pre-1914 Europe represent, in my opinion, a useful benchmark to evaluate the disruptiveness and novelty of paramilitary violence in post-1918 Europe. This is especially true in certain countries such as Spain and Italy, which didn't experience state collapse, actual and cultural defeat, or revolutionary contagion. I think that the usual causes of paramilitarism, therefore, should be integrated, at least for certain countries, with other factors which include enduring domestic conflicts, private, public, and civil military relationship, and state legitimation. This in order to create a sort of variable geometry framework enriched by other explanatory factors which should be added, not substitute other more traditional factors, and which can help us to make to account for specific histories and context in different cases and countries. This may help us, I think, to explain post-war paramilitarism, which was a unique and coherent phenomenon, but also an extremely multifaceted and complex one. So this can be useful, can help us to determine why forms of post-war violence and paramilitary violence acquire such a pivotal role, even victorious and neutral countries which did not experience the state collapse or ethnic strife. Thank you very much. I hope I was not, that presentation was not too long. Sorry for that anyway.
It was, thank you so much. Thanks for this really, really great lecture on European history in the years of the so-called Belle Époque. Seen from a specific angles, that is the one of the so-called armed associations. I think it's a really very interesting perspective to see at important topics of social, political, and cultural history of the entire continent. Of course, we in the project, we and you in the book are not able to cover every single country and every single city or village, but the trends are quite clear for all the for a good part of the European continent, let's say. I have lots of remarks and questions, but of course, this is due to the fact that I am kind of like close to the subject. And I don't want to monopolize the audience and the floor. So I would like to ask the audience if there is anyone who has questions, and then at the end I would eventually add my own. We have around like 20 minutes, right, for this Q&A. So maybe Valeria, you are better in moderating, or should I do? But anyway, I see already someone with a raised hand. I would call Mikhail Buktoyarov to ask his question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture. It was really insightful and a lot of very I would say rare information, which is quite new for me. My question is about the associations which probably could have major changes in their history. Because my question is about associations which use not only that military paradigm, not simply armed associations, but were there any cases when they were kind of hybrid associations which combined cultural, for example, I don't know, military orchestra or sporting associations which transformed gradually or at some point into military association, armed association, or vice versa? So kind of association which is positioning itself, which is presenting itself first as non-military, but then turning at some point into something that is related to the topic. Thank you.
Can I answer now, Nicola?
Yeah, I would say yes, and then eventually then we can collect.
Okay. Yeah, it's very interesting question. So just to be brief, in many cases, war-related armed associations develop from the scratch, let's say. But it was pretty. But there was also cases in which originally they had the different purposes, and then they turn into a much more militarized group. After all, it's also the case of the volunteer cyclists in Italy, but it's also the case of the motorist, yacht motorists in Germany. So basically, the idea was that to combine sports that at that time was becoming a huge social phenomenon with the defense of the country. So originally, the members of the volunteer cyclists were just cyclists, actually. So they basically people spending their weekends cycling around their cities and doing rides and so on and so forth. But after this first preliminary phase, they develop into also into a military association. But I would like to be clear on that. Armed associations were just a very, very small part of a huge phenomenon, which was associationism in Europe, which developed to unprecedented level in this period. But sure, in many cases, there were strong links between the association which were established with very different purposes and which assume a sort of military-like turn and features only later on. I don't have examples, at least, I mean, that came to my mind of like cultural associations turning into more military-like groups. Though, for example, in many of these associations, the cultural / intellectual activities were also part of the association life, like in the case of the Spanish Somatén, in which, for example, religion, but also Catalan history were performed and part of conferences, meetings, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I can also add.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Also from my side, from my own research, that what happens, for example, that there are shooting clubs that were established as sport associations, or differently, that they change their in a way that the features are so along the years. Are there some more questions? Yes, Valeria herself.
If I may, just quickly, because I'm aware that I'd love to hear your comments as well. First of all, thank you, Matteo, for this wonderful presentation. It's really comprehensive, and I would love to have more time to have a few questions, but I'll just pick one that kind of intersects some of my own reflections around sociability at large, which has to do with the differentiation between that you proposed in between these more associations more oriented towards actual violence, so having this social policing and anti-strike basically sentiment, and the more warlike ones. And you mentioned this quite in passing, but one of the key differentiations is also around whether violence is performed and understood as for real or just as a performative. And this for me is something I would love to hear a bit more from you, perhaps, if you care to come back, maybe Nicola as well, because from a perspective of just considering sociability, also something that one chooses sociologically to do with free time, and so there's always a connotation of like a cultural activity, this element of pretense of the kind of making violence exist in a magic cycle, a circle, if you like, to borrow from game studies, and so sometimes has been saluted as actually a way forward to contain social violence. So in other words, there are commentators that understand that we do need associational forms where we can channel these dark sides of civilization, be it sports, be it associations of, I don't know, that pretend to, they costume up as war making associations and so on. And this is saluted as like a positive avenue for channeling such dark instincts and containing them within magic circles that do not contaminate everyday lives. And whereas I would say that an association that understands the violence as an actual intervention in the social political sphere promotes a very different culture there. So I wonder, from an historian's perspective, whether any of these considerations were perhaps informing debates at the time, or I'm also a bit curious, perhaps more sociologically, whether this, because I totally can see that these two are also one and the same, or two sides of the same coin, as you were positing, but I wonder whether would it be the same people that would be involved in both? Are there any differentiations whether these two forms, I don't know, maybe become prominent? I wonder, I don't know, in urban areas versus rural areas, or I don't know. I'd really love to hear a bit more on this aspect, if I was clear at all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Valeria. They are very interesting question, and they probably require another paper, but I will try to spare you from that. So I will try to respond briefly. So I fully agree with you that sometimes the performing violence, dressing uniforms, using rifles for drillings and this kind of activities can be some kind of substitute from actual violence. This was especially true for youth armed associations. So the idea was to, especially in Britain, for example, is to take the young hooligans from the working class neighborhoods and turn them into gentlemen, It was one of the main purposes of groups like the Boys Brigade and the Church Lads Brigade. So the idea was to use military uniforms, military-like drilling, and sometimes dummy rifles or actual rifles in order to educate and tame, in some way, the temperance of working class young boys and the lads. So in many youth organizations, military style and practices were used for educational purposes and not to prepare the young boys for war. But there were other associations for young lads, for example, the so-called school battalions in France and other pre-military organizations in France, whose aim was specifically to train the boys for the military service and therefore for war. In the 1880s, one French minister of education said that basically his dreams was to have rifles in school, and he actually made a lot of efforts to give all the rifles of the army for young boys at schools in France. So the idea was to prepare young boys for war. In that case, violence was in some way still performative. So they trained for violence, but they didn't perpetrate actual violence. But the final aim, the final goal was to prepare soldiers to fight against Germany and other enemies of the state. So what I'm saying is that sometimes what you stress is true, but other times I think that the idea behind was to prepare people for the defense of the country or for war. The volunteer cyclists, for example, were obsessed by the fact that they can be part of the army in case of war. But it's also true that they reflected the spirit of the times. In some way, they were not obsessed with strategy, with technical aspect, but they believe that thanks to their will, patriotic spirit, and so on and so forth, they can fight the war better than the regular army. But it was absolutely, a sort of fantasy and delusion. There was also a second question, perhaps.
From Valeria?
No, for Valeria, maybe, I don't know.
There is Javier.
But I have a question.
Javier Toscano, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, because it's a follow-up on the very interesting question that Valeria said. But first of all, I want to thank you for your presentation. It was really nice to hear it. So as I said, it's like related to these topics of what Valeria brought into the discussion. I'm not a historian, so I'm coming from a sociological point of view in this respect. I would like to know regarding these ideas on like this kind of associations that funnel some form of energy, this violence into a civilizatory process or something. How can we, I don't know if you're familiar with exactly this, the thesis of Norbert Elias, the civilizatory process. So what is their role in these associations? If they are taking different paths, and where can we see symptoms of this process, and probably just extending not only that on this phenomenon on the pre-war periods, but probably if you even have some idea, where can we connect that? Because I think this is very observable in what is happening also in current forms, as Valeria mentioned. I see a different pattern in US American associations, rifle associations, their gaming groups, and of course, it opens up in different directions. So probably just if you can share just some thoughts on this civilizatory process regarding to the Elias thesis and this kind of emergence of these groups.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a very also a very interesting question, and I mean, as I said, I think it depends group by group in some way, and we should always consider the final aim and goal of these groups. So as I mentioned, it was pretty clear for for youth organization in certain countries, in which the idea was to civilize basically young lads from the working class. So the idea behind these groups, which were organized usually by religious men, both Anglican and Protestant, but also, I mean, you can think about also Baden-Powell Scout movement that at that time became a huge global phenomenon, which they were much less armed, but they were armed sometimes. So the idea was to create new good citizens and to use this organization in order to civilize and educate, especially boys, sometimes girls, coming from the working class. So the idea was to, you know, to transform people with different cultural and life experience into civilized, so to speak, proper Englishmen. However, in some cases, in other cases, I think it was to the opposite. So in many states, for example, Germany, Britain, France, also and partially Italy, sometimes perhaps the case of Spain and Austria-Hungary is slightly different. So the institution deputized to educate and civilize men was the school, of course, but also the army. So the idea that in this that armed association develop was perceived by regular military authorities as, in some cases, as a kind of support to the war effort, for sure, but also as a sort of challenge. So from the perspective of military elites and authorities, these war-related associations were not seen with in a good way, in a good light, because they represent some kind of a challenge to the effort to civilize and educate the nation that the army attributed to itself. So again, I think that we should be a little bit cautious on that. On the one side, I think that the phenomenon was unique and it was some kind of a single phenomenon, but at the same time was really multifaceted, and it depends. We should consider also different groups had different aims and goals. I hope I have answered a little bit, at least a little bit, your question.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. I would, if there are no other questions, and since we are at the time of the end, we came to the end, at least of the time we had available, I would just like add a few comments that don't require necessarily an answer, but of course you can still answer to those comments. I think that it's very hard to, of course, to create a framework for associations or groups of very different kind that are just they have just like a mutual future. That's the having guns or no, and this is, I think, that something that you succeeded very well in framing and in creating this frame, because we are talking about like associations that are very different and with very different purposes, from shooting clubs, like in my case, which are still different from shooting clubs eventually in Hungary or in other countries or in French. and two strike breakers in the British Empire or so. And so it's very interesting to have this theoretical frame in which you pose the different case studies, and this is really like a good success, I think. On the other hand, I think it's very interesting that you underlined always how strictly embedded in a legal framework all these associations were, so that they needed to be, I mean, it's clear that they are part of the state or they belong to the state, or they are on this side, on the side of the state or the state's authority. My question would be also a bit like, of course, what is on the other side of this? Of course, there is a strong, you mentioned also the strong anarchist movement in those years. And so I wonder if on the biographical level, for example, we have specific cases of people who recycle themselves or change their mind in a way and switch from the one side to the other. Might be possible, especially by strike breakers who were sometimes just like on the market in a way. So, but eventually they were ideological. They were not there convinced of being on the side of the strike breakers. So I think it's interesting to keep this in mind, but also to remember that the state, the area of the state and the legality was not the only one in Europe, of course, at the time. Just the opposite was the case. Of course, you mentioned it now briefly. One more thing, I think, like, it's, of course, our project was had a very clear time frame. We work on this like last years of the 19th century, the early the 20th century, until the First War. Also pre-wars highest is it called. But I would say that also we should keep in mind, I say this for myself at first, the long durée of this historical phenomenon. Of course, people carried guns or weapons before and after like the time of our project, and it's probably important to see. I mean, I see this from my project, and you, Matteo, you know this very well, how important has been history in the creation and of this identity, on keeping on this sense of solidarity among members of associations. But this play is also very important. I think it's important to see guns or this kind of like groups existed eventually before. What's the difference? What remains? What is new? What's the technological aspects of course, producing more weapons at one point in history made, of course, these armed associations eventually more popular and more, And of course, there's like a few more things to say about women in this story, because of course we were like talking all the time about men in uniforms, but just like at the end you mentioned some girls, and this would be also interesting to see whether women basically in your book play a role. And on the other hand, last remark is also a bit regarding, I mean, something that we have not really done in our research, but this kind of like biographical approach. Are there like people we were able to, I don't know, to look at as a example of this phenomenon or paradigma, let's say? I mean, Marinetti is a very famous personality, but eventually, I mean, it would be nice to see in a cultural perspective, let's say, this some biographical experiences, let's say. Okay, sorry. Just like you can keep this remarks, or just like give a
if
short.
You like, I can try to answer in a couple of minutes to your many questions, or at least to some of them. So very briefly, so from one career to another, it was of course the case of many some of the strike breakers. For example, those operating along the border between Germany and Austria. Many of them were former workers and even members of the left-wing unions, and then they turn into strike breakers. The founders of the yellow unions in France were all members of the socialist and anarchist unions, and they turn into strike breakers because they saw it more, preferable also for the pockets. It was also the case. There are a couple of interesting cases, and again, just to answer your question about the biography, I think it's something really important. But my attention, at least at this stage, was to try to to describe a phenomenon which was, I think, quite new in current historiographical understanding. But again, there are a few cases of people who first enroll in the Ulster Volunteer Force. So it was this huge militia fighting against the Home Rule in Ireland. And then they moved to the Irish Volunteers. They were the militia pro-Home Rule because they felt that they were more comfortable there. And the idea for them was just they loved drilling, having weapons and uniforms and this kind of adventurous feelings in some way. So there were possible some kind of mobility across different associations. About the role of women, so quite honestly, in my book, there are very few women. There are a lot of male cultures, I hope. Many of these groups were made by male. The idea was that only male can prepare themselves for war, though there were in the more structured groups, such as, again, the Irish Volunteers and the Ulster Volunteer Force, there were some kind of women corps or like auxiliary support, like nurses and, auxiliary activities. One of the founder of the Irish Boy Scout, which were quite militarized groups, was a countess, a very nationalist and committed to the cause of Irish nationalism, the Countess Markievicz. But generally speaking, women were not part of these groups. There were also powerful cultural bias to give weapons to women. Of course, there were exceptions, like in Paris or in major cities, but in provincial towns or in the countryside, in many European countries, the fact that women can be armed was seen as a sort of moral problem, first of all, and also because women were considered as a lunatic, a little bit crazy, not reliable, so no guns for women, even though national legislation in many cases didn't explicitly prohibited women from having guns, but it was a cultural framework which stopped them, and also because of the associational life in many cases was again a male prerogative. Not always, but you of course, if you combine owning a gun and gather with other people without men, it's really hard to find. But as you have studied, there were also few competitions also for of shooting competition also for women, but were seen as more some kind of exotic attraction than part of a sport or patriotic mobilization. Okay, sorry. I was really long in my talk, so I apologize if I postponed your lunch or whatever.
No, we followed with a lot of interest. I see it. I didn't see any sign of insufferance or
to the contrary.
Okay.
Thank you. Very. I think then that we can close the session, right, Valeria? I think I will thank you again very much for this. I'm very, very happy to have heard this and to have had this nice conversation at the end. And of course, we look forward to reading the book.
I'm still working on that, so it could be quite long.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah, so thank you,
Valeria.
Thank you to our guest, Professor Millan. It was really a pleasure to get to hear the preview of this work. Best of luck with the completion. Thanks for your time, which is always scarce. And thanks everyone who came and participated. And we'll be in touch. See you all next week, or some of you. in the
Okay.
next minute. Okay. Have a lovely week.
Ciao. Thank you very much.
Good weekend. Yeah.
Hi, thanks.
Ciao.
Ciao.